Oxford suffers its rituals of weather with the stoicism of old stone, and that Halloween evening submitted to a long, slanting rain that rinsed the streets until the lamps shimmered in puddles, like pools of brandy left unfinished by careless gods. I sat in the snug of the Eagle and Child in Jericho, nursing what I generously called sobriety, though the ache of a half-remembered aria from La Bohème made the abstinence feel less virtuous than merely necessary. The crossword lay before me like an old adversary, its grid half-conquered but stalled on a clue that seemed designed to mock. Vehicle for all souls. 7 letters. The pub held its usual congregation of those who prefer their solitude witnessed rather than absolute. A graduate student hunched over Wittgenstein in the corner, her coffee growing cold as philosophy. 2 elderly men debated cricket with the passion of theologians, arguing transubstantiation. The barman polished glasses with mechanical devotion, each one catching the amber light like captured time. Outside, the rain continued its patient work, transforming Halloween into something more melancholy than frightening, as if the city itself were remembering older sorrows than plastic masks could conjure. I found myself thinking about bridges and the people who cannot cross them, about the weight of water and the way it carries things we would rather forget. The aria drifted through my consciousness like smoke, its melancholic strains a fitting accompaniment to the evening's damp solemnity. 7 letters. Vehicle for all souls. A hearse seemed too obvious, a vessel too vague. The word played on my thoughts, intertwining with my musings about those necessary spans that connect disparate shores. My gaze, restless even in repose, drifted to the Oxford Mail folded beside my glass. A small item tucked between parish council minutes and heating repair advertisements caught my attention with the quiet insistence of a wrong note in a familiar symphony. The number, 17 amperes bus, had arrived at Street Aldate's depot just before midnight on Halloween. Empty, the brief report noted, completely devoid of passengers. Yet the seats were wet, the city hummed with its customary Halloween revelry, a cacophony of student masquerades and contrived frights. Laughter, thin and sharp, occasionally pierced the muted thrum of rain against window panes. But beneath this manufactured gaiety, I felt a familiar tremor of unease, a discordant note in the night's symphony. The rain, typically Oxford's grand explainer for all things damp and dishevelled, seemed to offer no satisfactory answer here. It should have explained everything about wet seats. Yet it explained nothing at all. The crossword clue resolved itself with the quiet certainty that comes after struggle. All Souls College, that peculiar institution without undergraduates, where fellows dine in perpetual twilight. An omnibus, vehicle for all, the democratic cousin of private carriages. I inked the letters with the resigned pleasure of a man surrendering to the obvious, noting how they crossed a word I had already placed. Isis, our patient river that carries its own census of the drowned. The mobile's insistent chirping shattered the fragile peace, just as the aria was resolving itself into a particularly poignant cadence. Strange's voice carried the particular weariness that comes from dealing with Halloween calls, but his tone shifted when he mentioned the bus. The driver had simply vanished, he explained. Mark Deller, 43, reliable as sunrise, had signed the vehicle out for a literary event at St. Simeon's College. Some sort of Halloween reading in their medieval chapel. The bus should have returned by 11, but it rolled into the depot driverless, its automatic systems engaging as programmed. I closed the crossword, the final clue solved but somehow unsatisfying. Halloween, it appeared, wanted an audience after all, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that the performance had already begun. The rain gentled to a whisper against my collar as I walked toward my car, the streets gleaming like black mirrors, reflecting a city that seemed suddenly less familiar than it had an hour before. The street, Aldate's depot, carried the indispensable scent of punctuality. Oil, wet rubber, and cheap coffee that had surrendered its ambitions hours before dawn. Jenny Lomas, the night clerk, possessed the particular alertness of those who shepherd the city's mechanical herds through darkness, her eyes sharp, despite the fluorescent pallor that comes from counting buses instead of sheep. She walked me through the evening's strangeness with the precision of someone whose incident reports had taught her that truth lives in small details. The 17 amperes had rolled into its designated bay at 23:47, she explained, its headlights extinguished, doors sealed with the mechanical certainty of systems obeying their programming. Yet no driver had emerged to complete the ritual of keys returned and logbook signed. She had boarded, expecting Halloween mischief, perhaps costumed students or a forgotten umbrella, but found instead something more troubling than pranks. Water-darkened fabric across several seats, the dampness forming irregular arcs as though someone had sat there while thoroughly soaked, then departed with careful deliberation. The smell troubled her more than the wetness itself. River water, certainly, but braided with something metallic that made her think of old coins left too long in pockets. I breathed deeply, catching that faint residue, noting how it seemed to cling to the upholstery with stubborn persistence. Rain leaves honest dampness. Rivers leave their own particular ghost. The pattern suggested not accident but arrangement, as if someone had marked specific seats for purposes that remained opaque. The duty register offered its small revelations. Mark Deller had signed out the vehicle at 6:03, his signature betraying none of the uncertainty that would later consume him. The return column gaped like a missing tooth, while the automatic arrival time sat oddly against the printed schedule. 17 minutes past the last advertised service, long enough for most explanations, too brief for absolution. The sealed doors intrigued me most. Central locking required knowledge of the control panel, suggesting either a driver's expertise or someone who had studied the mechanisms with particular attention. Street. Simeon's College received me with the honey-colored dignity of stones that had witnessed centuries of human folly without losing their composure. The porter directed me toward the bursary with weary courtesy, his manner suggesting that Halloween had brought more visitors than usual, none of them entirely welcome. Miriam Cole inhabited her domain with mathematical precision, each paper aligned with geometric certainty, her conversation flowing in the measured cadences of someone who understood that institutions survive through attention to contractual detail. She spoke of coaches rather than buses, the preference of those who invoice rather than travel. And when I mentioned keys, her response carried the fluency of someone who had considered this question before my asking. Temporary custody for events, she explained, times noted with the precision of a chess player recording moves. I watched her align a pencil with her blotter's edge and suspected she kept more than stationery in perfect order. Father Lionel Brooke materialized in the chapel with the genial warmth of someone who found divine purpose in human theater. He spoke fondly of the Halloween reading they had planned, his enthusiasm genuine despite the night's unfortunate conclusion. The medieval space suited ghost stories, he believed, its centuries of prayers having worn grooves in the very air. His laugh carried comfortable weight, though when he quoted Keats, he stumbled slightly, making mellow fruit plural where the poet had intended singular. Small errors often reveal large truths. Beatrice Hall arrived like a well-orchestrated entrance, her umbrella closing with Silk's discreet whisper. An audiobook producer of considerable reputation, she explained her presence as professional necessity. Recording atmospheric material for charity, capturing the chapel's unique acoustics for ghost story collections. Her voice carried the careful modulation of someone who made living from other people's words, though I sensed her own carried secrets worth hearing. The missing driver haunted our conversation without being named. Mark Deller, 43 years of reliable service, had vanished into Oxford's rainy night with thoroughness that suggested either careful planning or circumstances beyond his control. His locker contained only working life's usual detritus. Spare change, aspirin, a photograph of happier times. Standing in the chapel as afternoon light filtered through medieval glass, I noted how the recording equipment captured not just sound but silence, the particular quality of emptiness that follows significant events. The wet seats formed a pattern I was beginning to recognize. Not random dampness, but deliberate placement, as if someone had marked locations for purposes still hidden in the city's patient rain. The college corridors whispered with soft shoes and softer gossip, their ancient stones absorbing conversations like blotting paper soaks ink. News in such venerable institutions travels not through headlines, but through the quiet rustle of gowns and murmured exchanges over lukewarm tea. Dr. Alan Ventnor's absence began as rumor, crystallized into concern, and by morning had acquired the weight of certainty. The celebrated textual scholar, whose mellifluous voice had breathed life into Shakespeare's Kings for BBC recordings, had never delivered his Halloween performance. Father Brooke recounted the evening's dissolution with practiced neutrality, explaining how Ventnor had attended Compline with customary punctuality. The service concluding at 8:15, while the reading awaited at 9. Somewhere in that narrow hour, Ventnor had excused himself for what he termed a necessary walk, dissolving into the drizzle with the thoroughness of salt in water. His absence initially seemed merely inconvenient. Academics, particularly those of Ventnor's temperament, maintained complicated relationships with punctuality. The audience waited with patient forbearance, while Beatrice Hall tested her recording equipment and Father Brooke offered apologetic reassurances. By 9:30, concern had crystallized. By 10, the reading was quietly cancelled. Morning brought institutional machinery into motion. The Telegraph's afternoon edition carried a paragraph between cricket scores and harvest announcements. Distinguished Oxford Don fails to return home. The language bore that British restraint, suggesting worse news waiting in the wings. Evening delivered confirmation. The Cherwell yielded Dr. Ventnor near Magdalen Bridge, with the gentle dignity the river reserves for Oxford's own. The water police handled recovery with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed by too much experience with the city's liquid boundaries. His pockets contained the essential detritus of academic life. A chapel program folded twice, a pencil worn to comfortable familiarity, and a key that fit nothing obvious. I turned the key in my fingers, noting the shallow warding, the bow stamped with a faint manufacturer's crown. A locker key, perhaps, or cabinet lock, the sort preferring company to solitude. The shoulder was polished on one side only, suggesting use in a vertical lock where the hand lifts before turning. The program bore a crease starting from the upper left, the fold of a left-handed man, with Prospero circled among the readings. I have always distrusted circles that refuse to explain their circumference. The pencil's point had been blunted, then worried back to sharpness with a pocket knife. Actors favor 2B graphite for its smooth darkness, when paper must receive whispers without protest. Beatrice Hall received the news with visible contraction, as though grief were physical weight settling on her shoulders. She recovered professional composure with admirable speed, speaking of lost opportunities and charitable disappointments, but her hands betrayed her with their slight tremor. Miriam Cole confined herself to figures and institutional sorrow, noting Ventnor's punctual payments and exemplary conduct with the precision of someone measuring tragedy in administrative terms. Father Brooke's response proved more complex, his initial shock giving way to intended levity about obedient ghosts appearing when summoned. The joke landed with dull weight, and he seemed to realize this even as the words escaped. In the library, I encountered Rory Keane, a graduate student who carried his old English texts like wounds, their leather bindings worn smooth by anxious handling. His eyes held something beyond usual academic pressure, a haunted quality suggesting personal acquaintance with whatever demons had driven Ventnor to his necessary walk. When I mentioned the missing scholar, Keane's response came too quickly, too practiced, as though he had been rehearsing explanations for questions not yet asked. The key continued puzzling me, its weight suggesting significance beyond mere utility. Keys unlock doors, but they also represent access, permission, the crossing of thresholds both literal and metaphorical. What door had Ventnor needed to open on his final evening, and why had he carried the means but never reached the destination? The river, indifferent and exact, had rehearsed the last syllables of a voice trained all its life to resist endings. The Trout Inn at Godstow keeps its guest register with the devotion of a parish clerk. each signature preserved like evidence of human passage through time. The evening's entries revealed their customary catalogue of weekend pilgrims and academic refugees. But one name commanded attention through its theatrical precision: Prospero. Inscribed in clear, formal script with the confidence of someone accustomed to signing documents that mattered, the landlord, whose memory had been sharpened by decades of licensing laws and difficult patrons, recalled the guest with particular clarity. A gentleman of middle years, well-spoken, who had taken a room overlooking the weir but departed again within the hour, mentioning urgent business in the city. He had paid cash, which itself warranted notice in our increasingly plastic age. The Saab in the car park had caught attention through its number plate, something resembling a private joke, the landlord thought, though he couldn't quite reconstruct the wordplay. I noted this detail, understanding how vanity plates often reveal more about their owners than intended. Street Simeon's Porter's Lodge yielded its own small mysteries. The duty book showed Mark Della's signature at 6:03, his handwriting betraying the careful formation of someone who took pride in legible documentation. The return column gaped with eloquent emptiness, that absence speaking more loudly than any explanation could manage. When I mentioned the vehicle to Miriam Cole, she corrected my terminology with gentle precision, referring to it as a coach rather than a bus. I noted this not as academic pedantry but as careful listening. The bursar's distinction suggested institutional awareness of contracts and classifications that might prove significant. A bus serves routes and schedules. A coach implies private hire, specific destinations, tailored journeys. The difference, however subtle, spoke volumes about the nature of that Halloween booking. The chapel held afternoon light like amber, its medieval stones warming under October sun that had finally penetrated the morning's persistent clouds. Rory Keane moved through the space with nervous familiarity, his fingers trailing across the music stand as he recited Houseman with unconscious fluency. "Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows," he began, his voice carrying that particular melancholy that comes from understanding verse too intimately. "What are those green remembered hills? What spires? What farms are those?" The substitution was subtle enough to pass unnoticed by casual listeners, green for blue, but wrong enough to trouble anyone who knew Houseman's precise palate. I chose not to correct him, understanding that misquotation often reveals more than accuracy, but the error lodged itself in my mind like a splinter requiring eventual attention. Ventnor's office inhabited that peculiar academic twilight where scholarship accumulates in sedimentary layers. His copy of The Tempest bore the intimate scarring of frequent consultation, margins dense with annotations suggesting years of evolving interpretation. The library inscription on the flyleaf commanded particular attention: full fathom 5 for PMC. The dedication written in the same formal script I had observed in the Trout's register. Among the papers scattered across his desk, a receipt from Blackwell and Partners, solicitors, dated 3 days previous, recorded payment for will preparation and amendment. The sum suggested substantial revision rather than minor codicil, though the document itself remained beyond my immediate reach. The key from Ventnor's pocket continued puzzling me, its weight suggesting purpose beyond ornament. I tested it against various locks within the office, filing cabinets, desk drawers, a small wall safe, but found no match. Yet its presence implied accessibility, a door waiting somewhere for the proper moment of opening. The afternoon's discoveries formed a constellation of related mysteries: Prospero's cash payment and hasty departure, the coach that returned empty but wet, the misquoted Houseman, and the newly amended will. Each detail seemed significant in isolation, yet their connections remained obscure, like stars whose pattern awaits the proper season for revelation. The river, indifferent and exact, kept its own accounts in a ledger written with current and time. The college archives possessed their own climate, a stillness manufactured by centuries of accumulated scholarship, where dust motes danced in shafts of amber light, like memories made visible. The leather-bound volumes and manila folders exhaled the particular scent of institutional memory, that mixture of aged paper and forgotten secrets that makes libraries feel like confessionals. Here, among the carefully catalogued remnants of academic lives, Miriam Cole presented me with an envelope bearing Ventnor's precise handwriting and instructions clear as epitaph, to be opened upon my death. The letter possessed the straightforward indecency of a meeting agenda, its contents laid bare without ornament or apology. I read it once with professional attention. Then again, because the language stumbled where Ventnor's customary eloquence should have flowed. The document revealed itself as contrition rather than confession concerning an undergraduate river accident during Trinity Term 1998, when currents and content had conspired to take a boy named Patrick Hall. The tragedy had occurred during Eights Week, that peculiar Oxford ritual where rowing crews compete with ceremonial intensity while spectators consume champagne and pretend the river holds no dangers. Patrick Hall, cox of the second eight, had fallen during a collision between boats, his slight frame disappearing beneath waters made treacherous by inexperience and alcohol. The inquest had recorded misadventure, that convenient verdict which absolves institutions of uncomfortable questions while preserving their reputation for pastoral care. Yet Ventnor's letter suggested complexities the official record had overlooked. He wrote of inadequate supervision, of coaches who prioritized victory over safety, of a culture that treated the ISIS as playground rather than adversary. His guilt seemed less about specific actions than systematic failures, the accumulated negligence that creates conditions where accidents become inevitable. The prose carried weight, but not quite the weight I expected from a man whose marginalia could draw blood for a misplaced comma. The Hausmann quotation appeared near the letter's conclusion, wrong in a way that troubled my classical sensibilities. The lands of lost content, that plural transforming the poet's singular landscape into something more diffuse and therefore less precise. Hausmann had written of the land, that specific geography of memory where childhood dwells in permanent exile. Ventnor's version suggested multiple territories of loss, as though grief had colonized entire continents. It was not the kind of error a scholar of his caliber would make, not a man who could recite whole acts of Shakespeare from memory. The amended will, obtained through Blackwell and partners with loyally efficiency, revealed Ventnor's final attempt at restitution. His modest voice royalties from BBC recordings would flow to the Omnibus Trust, administered by one Giles Armitage, former Rowing Blue and keeper of what appeared to be a failing bus company. The connection seemed almost too elegant, therefore immediately pleasing to Lewis, who preferred his devils without footnotes and his coincidences explained by simple greed. Armitage's background emerged through careful inquiry. A talented oarsman who had rowed in the blue boat but never quite achieved the celebrity that transforms sporting excellence into lasting advantage, his transport company struggled against larger competitors, surviving through contracts with colleges and institutions that valued personal connection over corporate efficiency. The Omnibus Trust itself proved genuine enough, providing subsidized transport for care workers and pensioners, maintaining rural routes that commercial operators had abandoned. I requested the letter again, studying the misquoted Hausmann with growing unease. The error felt deliberate rather than accidental, as though someone had altered familiar text for purposes beyond my immediate comprehension. Certain phrases felt imported: the river's narrative, the community's arc, closure hard-earned. These were not Ventnor's rhythms, not his vocabulary. The letter read like someone else's voice wearing Ventnor's signature, a performance of contrition rather than its genuine expression. The archive's musty silence pressed against my thoughts as I folded the document. Guilt, carefully preserved for decades, now released into a world where its original context had dissolved. Yet something in the letter's construction suggested it had been written not in 1998, but much more recently, by someone who knew the story but hadn't lived it, who understood the facts but not their emotional texture. The river continued its patient work, carrying secrets and bodies with equal indifference, while somewhere in Oxford's labyrinthine streets, a bus company struggled against bankruptcy and a trust prepared to receive funds from the dead. Giles Armitage lived among expired timetables and efficient sadness, his office walls bearing witness to routes that had once connected villages now forgotten by progress. The depot in Cowley exhaled diesel and diminished hopes. Its collection of aging buses, maintained with the devotion of someone who understood that mechanical reliability could postpone but never prevent commercial failure. Here was a man shaped by water who now navigated the turbulent currents of commerce. Once a brilliant oarsman whose stroke had been flawless, but whose timing always arrived a heartbeat too late for immortality. His fleet kept losses just ahead of bankruptcy through careful attention to contracts that larger operators found unprofitable. The Omnibus Trust proved entirely genuine under scrutiny, its modest accounts revealing practical charity rather than suspicious prosperity. Armitage spoke of buying season tickets for care workers whose shifts ended after the last commercial service, subsidizing rural school routes that connected isolated children to education. The work possessed quiet dignity, a nobility that seemed at odds with the murky circumstances surrounding Ventnor's death. When I mentioned the will, Armitage disclaimed knowledge with alarming speed and practiced sincerity, his response arriving before my question had fully settled in the air between us. He spoke of surprise and unexpected generosity in measured tones that suggested rehearsal for an audience he had not expected to address so soon. The performance was competent but not quite convincing, like a student actor who understood the lines without inhabiting the character. It became easy to construct a plausible mechanism. Armitage, perhaps with Beatrice Hall providing elegant assistance, borrowing spare keys from street simians, staging the phantom bus with river water to suggest supernatural intervention, then moving Ventnor's body after one final confrontation near the water's edge. The scenario possessed the kind of elegant simplicity that satisfies through completeness. The motive of a failing business saved by unexpected inheritance, appealing to Lewis's preference for devils without footnotes. Yet the night's timing conspired against this attractive theory with stubborn persistence. CCTV footage from Jericho captured Armitage in heated discussion with a supplier at 11:30, his gestures animated by the particular frustration of someone whose invoices arrived faster than payments. His Audi displayed a parking ticket issued at 11:47, which he treated like a badge of honor, evidence of a man too preoccupied with legitimate business to worry about traffic wardens. Lewis embraced the alibi with characteristic thoroughness, his satisfaction evident as each detail confirmed Armitage's innocence. My attention drifted to a framed photograph on the office wall, a sepia-toned relic of the 1998 College 8. Young faces strained with effort, their oars caught mid-stroke against sun-dappled water. There, at the stern, sat Patrick Hall, the cox, his head turned sharply away from the camera as if unable to face something within the frame. While his teammates gazed forward with confident anticipation, Hall's profile suggested someone wrestling with knowledge that would not translate into words. The photograph's composition troubled me in ways I could not immediately articulate. Hall's averted gaze seemed to acknowledge secrets that the camera could document but not decode, his deliberate turning away echoing the misquoted houseman in Ventnor's purported letter. Both suggested intentional distortion, a refusal to look directly at singular, painful reality, the plural content, where the poet had written singular, the turned head, where convention demanded forward focus, small rebellions against truth that demanded examination. Armitage noticed my scrutiny and offered commentary with practiced fluency, speaking of promising crews and interrupted trajectories. His voice carried genuine regret, though whether for lost sporting glory or lost life remained deliberately ambiguous. The river teaches lessons that cannot be unlearned, he concluded, a sentiment that felt both profound and rehearsed. As we departed, I carried with me the image of that turned head, understanding that sometimes photographs, like misplaced words, offer glimpses of what lies beneath carefully constructed surfaces. The ghost bus remained plausible and wrong, like a line half remembered from a poem quoted too often. while somewhere between the pins on his route map and Patrick Hall's averted gaze, a truer narrative waited to be discovered. Rory Keane wrote in the Meters of the Dead, binding present injury to ancient verse with the devotion of someone who understood that poetry could transform pain into something bearable, if not beautiful. His latest composition lay scattered across his desk in the graduate quarters, manuscript pages dense with corrections that revealed a mind wrestling with both language and conscience. The poem employed heavy alliteration in the Anglo-Saxon manner, each line weighted with consonants that struck like measured blows. I read the verses with growing recognition, noting how the opening letters of each stanza spelled out a message too clever to remain entirely hidden. The work presented itself as meditation on mortality, but its imagery drew not from Beowulf's Whale Road, but from Oxford's more intimate waters. The empty carriage that came in, cold as coin. The bent backs of boatmen whose oars feathered wrong. These were specific observations clothed in archaic dress. Rory was not the murderer. I realized with surprising certainty. He was something more complex. The city's interpretation of itself, a consciousness that absorbed Oxford's secrets and transformed them into verse. His poem revealed intimate knowledge of the bus route and suggested something crucial, that someone had needed the Halloween performance recorded, preserved for purposes beyond mere charity. In Ventnor's rooms, a second inscription had surfaced during more thorough examination. A volume of Hausmann's collected works bore a dedication in familiar script. 4. P. H. May you find your way home. A. The book's margins contained annotations in two distinct hands, a dialogue conducted across pages about landscape and loss, memory and guilt's terrible persistence. A ragweek photograph, discovered between the volume's pages, showed a younger Ventnor whose grin stretched too tight across his face, standing beside Father Brooke, whose smile carried particular falseness. Miriam Cole's conspicuous absence from the group spoke as loudly as presence might have, suggesting someone who preferred documentation to participation, records to relationships. The photograph captured performative happiness that now seemed to foreshadow more profound drama. When I mentioned the misquoted Hausmann line from the letter, Rory's response arrived with startling precision. He attributed the error to Beatrice Hall, explaining how she liked to play recordings in her booth while working, letting voices wash over her like ambient sound. She says content, as if it were plural, which it isn't, he noted with pedantic accuracy. The observation struck me as significant. The mistake suggested someone who knew the poem through hearing rather than reading, who had absorbed its rhythm without attending to precise construction. It was the error of someone who worked with voices rather than texts, who understood sound before sense. In Beatrice's profession, such distinctions mattered the difference between what poets wrote and how actors spoke their words. The young scholar received my questions with nervous courtesy, his hands rearranging papers with unconscious precision. When I asked about his sources, he spoke of overheard conversations, glimpsed documents, the peculiar osmosis by which graduate students absorb institutional gossip. His knowledge seemed comprehensive yet second-hand, like someone who had studied battles from maps rather than witnessing carnage. Later, walking through the college's evening shadows, I considered how Rory's coded runes had captured something essential about that Halloween night, transforming confusion into patterns that suggested deeper meaning. His verse revealed not guilt, but observation, an artistic reconstruction that implied careful orchestration by another hand. The acrostic's cleverness troubled me less than its necessity. Why encode the bus number unless the poem itself served as evidence or confession? Yet Rory's manner suggested witness rather than participant, interpreter rather than actor. His lines about tickets punched through hearts and conductors who never called last stop carried the weight of metaphor rather than memory. Somewhere between his alliterative verses and Beatrice's plural content, between Ventnor's inscription and Patrick Hall's story, a narrative was assembling itself with patient inevitability. The river, as always, kept its own accounts, while Oxford stones absorbed another layer of secrets, waiting for someone skilled enough to read the city's accumulated text. Behind street, Simeon's library, tucked into what had once been a porter's lodge. Beatrice's studio occupied space, like a secret worth keeping. She arranged voices here with the devotion of a luthier shaping tone, each microphone positioned with surgical precision among walls lined with acoustic foam that absorbed more than sound. The air carried traces of magnetic tape and ozone, that particular atmosphere of captured time, while her console spread before us like an altar to the ephemeral made permanent. She moved through the equipment with unconscious grace, her hands finding controls with the certainty of long practice. When I mentioned technical details, she corrected me with professional courtesy, explaining the difference between guide tracks and shooting live, her voice carrying that authority which comes from specialized knowledge carefully acquired. The distinction mattered. She insisted guide tracks merely provided framework, while shooting live captured atmosphere in its raw, unfiltered authenticity. Only later would I recognize the significance of her correction. In explaining how they had shot live in the chapel to capture Stone's natural response, she had inadvertently admitted to traveling with the bus, contradicting her earlier suggestion of purely stationary involvement. I said nothing, allowing the moment to settle while she recovered with admirable composure, her professional mask reassembling itself with practiced efficiency. The Halloween recording revealed itself as an odd palimpsest. Layers of sound that told stories beyond their intended narrative. Rain provided steady percussion throughout, its rhythm marking time with melancholic precision. Beneath this honest weather lay an engine's idle, which should have been impossible. Jenny Lomas had explained, with weary expertise, that the 17 amperes operated on battery power when stationary, making such combustion rumble technically unfeasible. More intriguingly, a faint metallic chime threaded through the recording, reminiscent of Port Meadow's bicycle bells on Sunday mornings when mist rises from the Thames and Oxford prepares for another day of accumulated wisdom. Most distinctly, Magdalen's choir practice bled through from somewhere nearby, their disciplined voices carrying across night air with ethereal precision. The juxtaposition seemed almost too perfect, as though someone had orchestrated these elements for maximum atmospheric effect. A tape box labeled Prospero Last Pass commanded particular attention. Beatrice kept her eyes fixed on my hands as I examined it, her gaze following my fingers with the intensity of someone watching evidence being weighed. The inscription suggested multiple attempts, a performance refined through repetition until achieving desired perfection or perhaps desired deception. Without prompting, she offered a misquotation from Eliot, speaking of showing fear in a handful of grains rather than dust, as if making despair bite-sized and therefore more manageable. The alteration felt deliberate, a professional's instinct to soften poetry's sharper edges for popular consumption. Yet something in her delivery suggested personal acquaintance with the fear she referenced, as though those grains had been gathered from her own experience. Through the studio window, I observed her Saab sliding into a permit space, with the confidence of someone always late but never wrong. The vanity plate read H4LL Vox, a wordplay that announced both identity and profession while maintaining sufficient ambiguity to frustrate casual interpretation. The H4LL, pronounced as her surname, carried additional resonance when considered alongside Patrick Hall, the boy who had drowned in the Isis years before. Coincidence seemed increasingly unlikely. The recording equipment itself told stories through its configuration. Microphones positioned to capture not just direct sound but ambient atmosphere suggested someone interested in complete environmental documentation rather than simple dialogue recording. This was the arrangement of someone who understood that truth often lived in spaces between words, in breath before speech, and silence after revelation. As I prepared to leave, the studio's soundproofing seemed to press against my thoughts like accumulated secrets. The impossible engine idle, the carefully layered soundscape, the vanity plate's double meaning, each element suggested deliberate construction rather than accidental occurrence. Somewhere between Beatrice's professional competence and her inadvertent admissions, between the grains of her misquoted Eliot and the dust of actual truth. A narrative was assembling itself with patient inevitability. The rain resumed its gentle percussion against medieval glass, while inside, the reels settled with soft mechanical sighs, like small clocks correcting themselves after measuring time they were never meant to record. Father Brooke hunched over a glass that had forgotten the virtue of moderation, his shoulders bearing the particular weight that comes from carrying institutional secrets through too many Oxford winters. The pub's amber light caught his whiskey like captured time, and when he finally spoke, his confession arrived with the rehearsed cadence of someone who had practiced absolution in private moments. The students had craved theatrical eeriness for their Halloween recording, he explained, something authentically spectral to enhance Beatrice's charitable production. He had instructed Mark Deller to oblige their appetite for atmosphere with calculated mischief river water splashed across designated seats, lights extinguished at the climax of Ventnor's ghost story, the driver stepping discreetly outside for a cigarette while the bus performed its empty return through automated systems. The timing had been choreographed with ecclesiastical precision, each element designed to create genuine fright rather than mere costume drama. The explanation satisfied with such devastating completeness that disappointment settled in my chest like indigestion. It accounted for wet seats without supernatural intervention, empty aisles without genuine mystery, recorded atmosphere prettied for charity consumption. The scheme even wrapped the missing driver in comprehensible human folly, transforming potential tragedy into mere embarrassment, requiring discretion rather than investigation. Yet my unease deepened precisely because the comfort felt too complete, too neatly tailored to address every anomaly we had discovered. The technical details troubled me most. Father Brooke's casual mention of central locking systems and automated fail-safes suggested knowledge uncomfortably comprehensive for a chaplain whose expertise should involve liturgical rather than mechanical matters. The bus smell haunted my memory with stubborn persistence. Jenny Lomas had described something beyond honest dampness, that metallic undertone braided with river water, which wasn't merely the Cherwell's innocent green. Duckweed stains the senses differently when you've rowed in wrong places, when you've pulled oars through the heavier, slower currents of the Isis near Port Meadow, where water lies thick with vegetative decay. The Cherwell flows with cleaner vigor, rarely yielding such botanical density. Beatrice's recording continued puzzling me, that engine idle humming through speakers when battery power should have maintained perfect silence. The impossibility suggested either technical malfunction or deliberate deception, neither of which Father Brooke's narrative addressed satisfactorily. Most persistently, the Hausmann misquotation refused proper burial. The lands of lost content, plural where the poet had written singular. That specific geography where memory preserves what time destroys. I have never believed in lands for grief. Sorrow typically inhabits singular territory, precise and irreplaceable. The alterations suggested someone who understood loss as diffuse rather than focused, collected rather than experienced. Prospero stirred in my consciousness. That formal script in the Trout's register, the vanity plate H4LL Vox with its double meaning, the tape box labeled Last Pass. These elements formed patterns too deliberate for coincidence, too literary for simple pranks. Father Brooke's explanation addressed symptoms while ignoring the disease, providing mechanical answers for questions that demanded human understanding. The key from Ventnor's pocket pressed against my palm, its shoulder burnished on one side from vertical lifting. Not chapel locks, not desk drawers, but something requiring specific access, perhaps a locker where coats waited with other men's breath in their linings, where secrets accumulated like dust in forgotten corners. Lewis would embrace Father Brooke's confession with characteristic relief, filing it under institutional mischief rather than criminal investigation. The CCTV had cleared Armitage, the parking ticket provided alibi, the trust proved genuine. We could close books and return to simpler mysteries, but comfort unsettles me in proportion to its completeness. The ghost had been explained with admirable efficiency, yet the explanation itself had acquired spectral qualities, hovering between plausible and impossible like morning mist above the Thames. Somewhere between Father Brooke's comprehensive narrative and the stubborn facts that refused accommodation, the real story waited with patient inevitability. The river keeps its secrets with persistence that outlasts human folly, while Oxford's stones absorb another layer of carefully constructed lies, waiting for someone skilled enough to read the city's accumulated text of truth and deception intertwined. Oxford trains the mind for repetition, for returning to texts until their secrets surrender through patient scholarship, and I found myself drawn back to the 1998 letter with compulsive fascination. Each reading revealed fresh anomalies that accumulated like sediment in still water, small deviations from expected patterns that suggested deliberate construction rather than authentic confession. The plural content in the misquoted Husman troubled me most persistently. Ventnor's pedantry would have bled before permitting such casual violence to beloved verse, transforming the poet's singular landscape of lost childhood into multiple territories of grief. More subtly, the letter contained an oddly American fall, where proper English demanded autumn, a linguistic slip that betrayed transatlantic influences in the composer's ear. These were the habits of someone who smoothed quotations to suit pronunciation rather than accuracy, who altered the world to fit recording levels. Such characteristics belonged neither to Ventnor, whose scholarly precision was legendary, nor to Father Brooke, whose mistakes ran toward biblical confusion and beery sentiment. They belonged instead to an editor, a producer, someone accustomed to shaping meaning through technical manipulation rather than textual fidelity. The Trout's landlord, his memory flattered into renewed clarity, had recovered the Saab's distinctive plate with surprising precision. H4, LL Vox, a wordplay that announced both identity and profession while carrying darker resonance when considered alongside Patrick Hall's drowning. More significantly, Beatrice had been present when Prospero signed the register, her arrival timed with suspicious coordination. Lewis, with his talent for connecting practical details, had traced the metallic chime in Beatrice's recording through acoustic analysis. The bicycle bell, when mapped against known locations, suggested Port Meadow rather than Magdalen's vicinity. This distinction relocated the scene from the Cherwell's innocent green to the Isis, where water moved with different rhythms and carried the botanical heaviness that had troubled Jenny Lomas's memory. The tape box labeled Prospero Last Pass acquired profound significance when examined alongside Ventnor's marginalia. His copy of The Tempest bore annotations suggesting the role held particular meaning, perhaps as rehearsal for self-forgiveness that had eluded him in life. The character who creates storms then calms them, who orchestrates suffering then grants redemption, would appeal to someone wrestling with institutional guilt over a student's death. The key from Ventnor's pocket surrendered its secret through methodical testing at the depot. It fit Mark Della's locker, where his working coat waited with another man's breath, still clinging to its fabric. The garment had been borrowed, not for driving, but because someone trusted had convinced him that a final scene required authentic costume, that proper atmosphere demanded genuine props. Della's disappearance transformed from flight into unwitting participation. He had stepped out of the narrative once his role was complete, perhaps never understanding that his cooperation extended beyond theatrical collaboration into something more permanent. The missing driver had become accomplice to his own erasure from the story. Beatrice's studio equipment told its own tale through careful examination. Microphones positioned to capture ambient sound rather than focused dialogue, levels adjusted to blend multiple sources into seamless atmosphere. This was the work of someone who understood that truth could be constructed through technical mastery, that reality could be edited to serve emotional rather than factual accuracy. The evening's events crystallized into clearer focus. Ventnor's necessary walk had led to the Trout, where Prospero waited with rehearsed reconciliation. The coach journey to Port Meadow, where water possessed appropriate gravity for confession and absolution. The recording of final words, perhaps genuine repentance, captured for posterity before the river claimed its delayed justice. Yet, something in this reconstruction felt incomplete, like a symphony missing its final movement. The mechanics satisfied, but the motivation remained partially obscured, as though I understood the how while the why continued hiding in Oxford's patient shadows. The river, indifferent and exact, had kept its accounts with characteristic precision, while somewhere between Beatrice's technical expertise and Ventnor's theatrical finale, the complete truth waited for one more revelation to illuminate the design's full scope. In the recording booth, Beatrice sat like a clock that had chosen not to strike, her hands resting with deliberate stillness near the faders, where she had shaped so many voices into palatable truths. The acoustic foam absorbed our words before they could escape, creating a confessional space where secrets might be spoken without echo. She didn't deny the trout when I mentioned it, didn't deny Prospero's theatrical signature, didn't deny her connection to Giles Armitage through chapel microphone financing that had brought professional necessity into personal vengeance. For an uncharitable span, she didn't deny the deeper past either. Patrick Hall had been her brother, she explained with the measured precision of someone who had rehearsed this revelation through sleepless nights. Drowned in 1998 when dons and boatmen were equally drunk on college impunity, when institutional reputation mattered more than undergraduate safety. Ventnor's inquiry testimony had emerged cleaner than the river that claimed Patrick, his careful words absolving the college while burying uncomfortable questions about supervision and care. She had invited Ventnor to record something for charity, she continued, her producer's voice maintaining professional neutrality even as personal pains surfaced. During their session, she had played him his own archived voice from BBC recordings, that younger Ventnor speaking Shakespeare's drowned king, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies." She asked him to speak truth into her microphone, because that's what voices are for, not entertainment, but testimony, confession, the preservation of what would otherwise dissolve into institutional silence. He had walked with her to the trout to inhabit Prospero's role one final time, then to Port Meadow's darker waters to be himself without theatrical protection. She insisted with quiet vehemence that she hadn't pushed his failing heart. The bitter rain, decades of carrying institutional guilt had proved sufficient. She had turned away until the river accomplished what conscience could not, its patient currents claiming delayed justice with characteristic indifference. The staging had been her contribution to the narrative. She had moved the tape, not the body, to protect the only truth she could manage. The wet seats would suggest pranks rather than tragedy, allowing the college to remain wrapped in comfortable mythology. Father Brooks' explanation had provided perfect cover, transforming death into theatrical excess. When I mentioned her editorial habits, she responded with surprising directness. She misquoted poets because sometimes poems tell less truth than a producer with deadlines, she observed. Content became plural because grief rarely inhabits singular territory. Dust became grains because fear needed to be manageable rather than overwhelming. The 1,998 letter had been her composition, not Ventnor's and editor's smoothing of institutional guilt into acceptable confession. Lewis asked about the will with characteristic bluntness. She flinched at Ventnor's unexpected attempt to pay for bridges he had never crossed. His bequest to the Omnibus Trust, a gesture toward redemption that money could hardly accomplish. The irony wasn't lost on her. Patrick's death funding transport for others, institutional guilt financing community service. "You think I'm the villain because I edit," she said finally, her voice carrying resignation rather than defiance. The accusation settled in the booth's manufactured silence while I considered the complexity of her position: sister seeking justice, professional preserving truth, woman orchestrating reconciliation between the living and the dead. My silence wasn't agreement, though neither was it condemnation. The river had claimed its due with characteristic patience, while Oxford stones absorbed another layer of carefully constructed narrative. Between Beatrice's technical expertise and Ventnor's theatrical finale, between institutional guilt and personal grief, truth had found its own level, like water seeking equilibrium. The recording equipment hummed with electronic persistence, preserving our conversation for whatever archive would catalogue this intersection of justice and sorrow. While outside, the ancient city continued its patient work of transforming human folly into acceptable legend. Oxford folds itself around scandal until only a tidy corner shows from the bookcase, the rest ironed smooth beneath institutional memory's practiced hand. The college held a choral service for Ventnor that managed to be both sincere and implausible, treble voices rising like incense toward medieval stone. While colleagues who had known him more as recorded voice than living presence offered their carefully measured grief, the hymns possessed that particular Oxford quality of transforming human tragedy into acceptable liturgy. Father Brooke announced his early retirement with unseemly haste, accepting a fenland parish where rivers run flatter and lies travel farther before encountering the resistance of knowing stones. His departure carried the relief of someone escaping consequences rather than embracing ministry, though he spoke of rural souls needing guidance with practiced conviction. I pictured him among congregants more accustomed to soil's honest truths than academic complexity. Giles Armitage's omnibus trust received. Against his increasingly desperate protestations, Ventnor's posthumous royalties through legal machinery that ground forward with implacable precision. He channeled the unexpected inheritance into a village hospice route connecting Kidlington's care facilities. And while no one was improved by this moral exactness, everyone became briefly tolerable to themselves. The irony wasn't lost. Patrick Hall's death funding transport for the dying, institutional guilt financing final journeys. Beatrice faced the lesser charges that law constructs for complicated failures to save drowning men, her case proceeding through magistrates' courts with measured dignity reserved for educated defendants whose crimes resist simple classification. She would carry her particular burden of knowledge, that voice captured forever on tape speaking its final, unvarnished truth. Rory published his poem in the university magazine after removing the acrostic cleverness and restoring Hausmann's line to its proper, singular form. The verses lost their coded message but gained authentic melancholy, transforming from puzzle into genuine meditation on loss. His editorial choices suggested someone who understood the difference between performance and truth. Miriam Cole sighed in the quadrangle with uninviting grace, her breath visible in afternoon's chill as she contemplated ledgers that would never quite balance. When I approached and asked for a drink, she declined with practiced efficiency. Not now, not another time either. Her rejection carried the weight of someone who had learned to distinguish between professional courtesy and personal interest, understanding that some bridges, once burned, leave no foundation for reconstruction. I returned to my rooms as afternoon unstitched itself into evening, the air carrying rain's promise and boiler dust's familiar comfort. A crossword lay abandoned on my kitchen table, and I finished it by accident, answers falling into place as if someone had tilted the board. Vehicle for all souls, I had written omnibus, smiling at the obsolescence of both word and sentiment. From the wireless, a half-remembered aria from La Bohème refused to find its cadence. I hummed what I could and allowed the rest to remain beautifully incomplete. Strange telephoned about Sunday arrangements, his voice carrying friendship's genial tyranny. "Come round," he said, in that way people announce decisions already made. I answered yes, and meant perhaps, understanding that middle age consists largely of agreements made with weather and bones. On the table, the chapel program waited with Prospero circled in fading ink. I ran a finger through the wet ring my glass had left, watching it absorb into paper like tide, finally permitted to return. On the program's last page, I wrote because it pleased me to pretend memory could be indexed. Nothing moves without a voice. The observation looked like a note to myself and became, surprisingly, an argument with the entire case. I thought of the bus that had arrived empty, seats wet with river breath, of hands that had arranged this final tableau for reasons neither vindictive nor clean. The river keeps everything we give it in water's precise language, translating human folly into currents and sediment, guilt into geography. Oxford's past had been dragged forward by rope of sound, pulled over gravel, filed neat, and left to dry. The city breathed as evening reached its proper depth. Lamps shuddered as if someone had whispered small corrections into their glass. Somewhere close, or perhaps a lifetime away, an engine turned over and went nowhere. Mechanical persistence meeting atmospheric resistance in that eternal Oxford struggle between motion and endurance.